Alright, let me ask you something. What if I told you that in 1936, one single rifle gave every American soldier the firepower of two enemy soldiers combined before the war even started? Not because America had better training, not because they had more men, not because they had more money, but because one Canadian immigrant working in a government basement came up with something nobody else had figured out yet. My name is Eddie Arsenal, and today we are talking about the M1 Garand, the rifle that General George Patton himself called the greatest battle implement ever devised. And trust me, Patton was not the type of guy who handed out compliments. But before we get into why this rifle was so insanely good, we need to understand what every other soldier on the planet was working with. Because without that context, you won't fully appreciate just how big of a deal this thing actually was. Picture this. It's 1939. War just broke out in Europe, and almost every single army in the world is handing their soldiers bolt-action rifles. The Germans have the Kar 98K, the British have the Lee Enfield, the Japanese have the Arisaka, the Soviets have the Mosin Nagant. All of these rifles work the same basic way. You fire one shot, and then you have to manually operate the bolt. That means lifting the bolt handle up, pulling it all the way back, pushing it all the way forward, and locking it back down before you can fire again. That whole process takes about 2 to 3 seconds for a trained soldier. 2 to 3 seconds doesn't sound like a lot. Until you're in a firefight, and 2 to 3 seconds is the difference between you shooting first and you going home in a box. A well-trained German soldier with a Kar 98K could fire about 15 rounds per minute in perfect conditions. 15 rounds per minute sounds impressive until you realize what the American soldier standing across from him could do. The American with an M1 Garand could fire 40 to 50 rounds per minute, consistently, accurately, without stopping to cycle anything manually. That German soldier isn't just outgunned, he's fighting a completely different kind of weapon. So where did this rifle come from? Who built it? And why did it take the rest of the world until after the war to figure out what America already knew in 1936? Let's start at the very beginning. John Garand was born in 1888 in Saint-Rémy, Quebec, Canada. His family moved to Connecticut when he was a child, and by the time he was 11 years old, he was already working in textile mills and machine shops. 11 years old, working with heavy machinery. In 1899, and people today complain about homework. From a very young age, Garand had an almost supernatural ability to understand how mechanical things worked. He could look at a machine, take it apart in his head, and figure out how to make it better, and he never stopped doing that his entire life. In 1919, the US Army put out a request. They wanted someone to design a new semi-automatic rifle for the infantry. Semi-automatic meaning the rifle reloads itself after every shot, so the shooter just has to pull the trigger again. This was a huge ask. Nobody had successfully built a semi-automatic rifle that was reliable enough, light enough, and tough enough to survive actual combat conditions. Several designers had tried and failed spectacularly. John Garand said, "Yeah, I can do that." And then he spent the next 17 years doing exactly that. 17 years! This man worked on this rifle for 17 years before the Army finally said, yes, this is the one. Most people give up on things after 17 days. This guy spent 17 years perfecting a single weapon. The final design that the Army adopted in 1936 was a gas-operated, rotating bolt, semi-automatic rifle. And those 3 words are the entire secret to why this rifle was so revolutionary. Let's break that down one piece at a time, because this is where it gets really interesting. Gas-operated. What does that mean exactly? Every time a rifle fires, there's a massive amount of expanding gas created by the burning propellant behind the bullet. In a bolt-action rifle, all that gas just vents out the muzzle after the bullet leaves, completely wasted energy. John Garand looked at that wasted energy and thought, wait a minute, what if we use that to reload the rifle? What if, instead of letting that gas escape uselessly, we captured a tiny amount of it and used it to do the work of cycling the action? So he drilled a tiny hole in the barrel near the muzzle, called the gas port. Every time the rifle fires and the bullet passes that hole, a small amount of hot gas bleeds through it and enters a tube below the barrel. That gas pushes against a piston. The piston pushes an operating rod. The operating rod pushes the bolt carrier rearward. The bolt rotates and unlocks, slides back, ejects the spent casing, compresses the recoil spring, and then the spring pushes everything back forward, stripping a fresh round from the magazine and chambering it. All of that, Every single step of that process happens in a fraction of a second, automatically, every single time you pull the trigger. The shooter does absolutely nothing except aim and pull. Now let's talk about the magazine system, because this is where the Garand gets a little controversial, and also where one of the greatest myths of the entire war was born. The M1 Garand doesn't use a detachable box magazine like most modern rifles. Instead, it uses what's called an in-block clip, a stamped sheet metal container that holds 8 rounds of .3006 Springfield ammunition. To load the rifle, you open the bolt, press the entire N-block clip, rounds and all, straight down into the receiver until it clicks in. The bolt then slams forward automatically, chambering the first round, and you are ready to fire. 8 rounds. .3006 Springfield. That's a big, serious, full-power rifle cartridge that was accurate and lethal at ranges well beyond 500 yards. This wasn't a pea shooter. This was a genuine long-range precision weapon that also happened to fire as fast as you could pull the trigger. And when that 8th round fires, here's the moment everybody loves. The empty on-block clip is automatically ejected out the top of the open receiver with a very distinctive metallic sound. Ping, that's the sound. That tiny little metallic ping became one of the most recognized sounds of the entire Second World War, and it also became the center of one of the war's most famous myths. The myth goes like this. German soldiers on the Eastern Front and in Italy learned to listen for the ping sound during firefights. The moment they heard it, they knew the Americans' rifle was empty and had to be reloaded, and that was their signal to attack. It's a great story. It really is. The problem is that it almost certainly never happened in any meaningful way, and here's why. In a real combat firefight, you have machine guns firing, artillery shells exploding, mortars hitting the ground, men shouting, engines running, aircraft overhead. The noise level in an actual battle is absolutely deafening. The idea that a German soldier 30 meters away could hear one tiny metal clip bouncing off the dirt through all of that chaos, and then recognize that specific sound, and then make a tactical decision based on it is basically impossible. And on top of that, experienced American soldiers could reload the Garand in under 5 seconds. Even if a German soldier somehow heard the ping and immediately started charging, he'd have closed maybe 10 meters before the American was already back in action. The myth has been investigated by historians, veterans, and weapons experts for decades, and the consensus is pretty clear. It makes for a great story, but in the chaos of real combat, it was never a real tactical problem. Now, there was one genuine criticism of the on-block clip system, and it's a legitimate one. You cannot top off the Garand mid-battle the way you can with a detachable magazine rifle. If you fired 5 rounds and wanted to reload before a big push, you had to eject the remaining 3 rounds with the clip and load a fresh full clip. You couldn't just add 3 loose rounds to top it off. In practice, most soldiers didn't worry about this. They just kept firing until the clip ejected and then reloaded. But it was a design limitation that later American rifles would eventually address. So with all of that said, how did this rifle actually perform in combat? Because a weapon can look great on paper and fall apart the moment sand, mud, rain, and actual bullets get involved. The M1 Garand's combat debut came in the Pacific Theater in North Africa in 1942, and the reports coming back from soldiers and officers were almost universally the same. This rifle is extraordinary. In the Pacific, American Marines and soldiers were fighting Japanese infantry who were armed with the Arisaka bolt-action rifle. A decent weapon, but one that put Japanese soldiers at an immediate and severe firepower disadvantage at close and medium range. American soldiers could lay down a volume of semi-automatic fire that was simply impossible to match with a bolt-action rifle. In jungle fighting where distances were short and firefights were fast and intense, the Garand's rate of fire was absolutely devastating. In North Africa, the story was similar, but against a more sophisticated enemy. German infantry, armed with Kar 98K rifles and supported by MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns, were still shocked by the volume of aimed semi-automatic fire coming from American infantry units. There are multiple accounts from German veterans describing their surprise at the rate of fire from American soldiers, many of them initially reporting back that Americans were equipped with automatic weapons, not understanding that semi-automatic rifles even existed at this scale. And the rifle wasn't just effective, it was reliable. The Garand functioned in the jungles of the Pacific, the deserts of North Africa, the mud of Italy, the snow of the Ardennes, and the rubble of German cities, without significant mechanical problems. The gas system was robust, the rotating bolt was strong, the overall construction was solid and well-engineered. Soldiers trusted this rifle completely, and that trust is the highest compliment any weapon can receive. By the end of the war, the United States had produced approximately 5.4 million M1 Garand rifles. 5.4 million. That's more than the entire population of New Zealand carrying the same weapon. But here's the thing that really tells you how good this rifle was. It didn't stop being used when the war ended. The M1 Garand went on to serve as the standard U.S. infantry rifle through the Korean War as well. American soldiers carried the Garand into the freezing mountains of Korea in the early 1950s, and again, the rifle performed. In temperatures cold enough to freeze bolt-action rifles solid, the Garand kept functioning. Korean War veterans reported that the gas-operated system of the Garand was actually an advantage in extreme cold because the gas operation was less sensitive to the lubrication problems that plagued other rifle designs in freezing temperatures. The rifle was finally replaced as the standard U.S. service rifle in 1957 by the M14, which, and this is not a coincidence, was essentially a modernized M1 Garand with a detachable 20-round magazine. Even the rifle that replaced the Garand was basically just a better Garand. That tells you everything you need to know about how fundamentally correct John Garand's original design was. Now let's talk about the other armies. Because while America went to war with the best infantry rifle in the world, everyone else was scrambling to figure out what they were missing. Germany actually recognized the problem early. By 1941, they had developed their own semi-automatic rifle, the Gewehr 41. But it was a mechanical nightmare, heavy, unreliable, and complex to manufacture. They followed that up with the Gewehr 43, which was better. But by the time it reached troops in meaningful numbers, the war was already turning against Germany, and they couldn't produce enough of them to make a real difference. The Soviet Union developed the SVT-40, a semi-automatic rifle that was actually quite good. But Soviet doctrine and manufacturing priorities meant that most Soviet soldiers still carried bolt-action Mosin Nagants throughout most of the war. Britain never developed a semi-automatic rifle for general infantry use during the war at all. They stuck with the Lee-Enfield bolt-action from start to finish. A very good bolt-action rifle, but a bolt-action nonetheless. Japan never even seriously attempted to develop a semi-automatic infantry rifle for general issue. They went through the entire war with bolt-action rifles, and their soldiers paid a terrible price for that disadvantage in Pacific Island fighting. So America was essentially the only major power in the war that equipped its standard infantry with a semi-automatic rifle from the very beginning, and that advantage compounded over millions of individual engagements across every theater of the war. Think about what that means at the individual soldier level. In any given firefight between an American squad and a German squad of equal size, the Americans could put roughly 3 times as many aimed rounds downrange in the same amount of time. 3 times? Not because the Americans were better shots, not because they had more training, just because their rifle reloaded itself and the German rifle didn't. That is the entire ball game right there. Now I want to tell you about John Garand himself for a moment, because the man who designed arguably the most important infantry rifle of the 20th century had one of the most quietly tragic endings you'll ever hear. John Garand spent his entire working career at the Springfield Armory as a government employee. He never held a patent on the M1 Garand. He never received royalties. He never got rich from his invention. The United States government owned the design. Garand was a federal employee doing his job. The 5.4 million rifles produced, the billions of dollars in contracts, none of that went to John Garand personally. He received a bonus of $100 when the rifle was adopted. $100 for a weapon that helped win the Second World War. Congress actually tried multiple times to award Garand a significant financial compensation for his contribution, but the bills kept dying in committee or getting reduced to token amounts. The man who gave America its greatest weapon died relatively modestly in 1974. There's something deeply American about that story, not in a proud way, but in a very real, very human way. The guy who did the most important work got the least recognition, while the weapon he built changed the course of history. But the soldiers knew. Veterans who carried the Garand never forgot it. Decades after the war, old men in their 80s and 90s would still light up when someone mentioned the M1 Garand, because that rifle had saved their lives. There are accounts of veterans at gun shows and museums reaching out to touch a Garand on display and just standing there quietly for a moment. Because for them, it wasn't a museum piece. It was the thing that brought them home. And the rifle still exists in huge numbers today. The civilian marksmanship program has sold hundreds of thousands of surplus M1 Garands to American civilians, and they are still being actively shot in competitions, collected, and treasured. If you go to a rifle competition today, 80 years after this weapon was designed, you will find M1 Garands being fired by enthusiasts who just appreciate how well this thing works. That is the definition of a timeless design. So let me bring it all back together, because I want you to really understand what made the M1 Garand special, beyond just the technical specifications. It wasn't just that it was semi-automatic. Semi-automatic rifles existed before the Garand. What made it special was that it was the first semi-automatic rifle that was reliable enough, rugged enough, accurate enough, and simple enough to be trusted by millions of ordinary soldiers in the worst conditions imaginable. John Garand didn't just invent a mechanism, he solved the entire problem. Reliability, durability, accuracy, simplicity, and manufacturability, all in one package. That's why it took 17 years. That's why no one else had done it before. The M1 Garand, chambered in .3006 Springfield, with its 8-round in-block clip, its gas-operated rotating bolt, its rugged steel and walnut construction, was the complete answer to a question that every army in the world was asking but couldn't solve. And the answer came from a Canadian immigrant working in a government workshop in Springfield, Massachusetts, a man who started his career at age 11 and spent his entire life obsessed with making mechanisms work perfectly. The next time someone tells you that one person can't change history, tell them about John Garand. One man, one rifle, 17 years of work, and the course of the most destructive war in human history shifted because of it. The M1 Garand, 9.5 pounds of American engineering perfection. The rifle that made every other infantry weapon on the planet look like it belonged in a museum before the war was even over. And that is why General Patton, a man who hated weakness, hated excuses, and hated everything that wasn't absolutely the best, called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. Because it was. Full stop. No argument. Eddie Arsenal has spoken. If you want to see what happened when Germany finally figured out semi-automatic rifles and tried to catch up, that story is coming next. And trust me, it did not go well for them. Subscribe to Eddie Arsenal, hit the bell so you don't miss it, and I will see you in the next one. Let's load it up.